Good to see you, John. Thanks for joining us.
Of course.
So I know you're from the IT side of the house, and I know a lot of folks like you are suddenly thrust with OT and responsible for protecting these very different, diverse systems. I know it's part of your story. Kind of like to hear more about how it's going for you and some of the challenges that you've kind of run into.
Yeah, I mean, I would say it starts with the fact that the incentives are pretty different between IT and OT organizations. In my experience, the operations are going to primarily be focused on production and efficiency and keeping safety in mind, obviously. Whereas in IT, we have the luxury of thinking about things like cybersecurity and downtime is not necessarily front of mind for us. But that difference in incentive can drive different behavior on both sides, and so trying to navigate that is really important. And frankly, there's some terminology and language differences in the way that we approach our work as well. So having a way to communicate effectively is critical to the success of any initiative that drives beyond the outside area of IT.
So from your perspective, what is driving this kind of forced union? Is it strictly convergence and connecting OT to the network, to the internet, or is it something else particularly?
Yeah, I mean, you kind of nailed it right there. There are more connected devices now than there have ever been. In fact, in an OT environment, we're seeing things that have no relevance to making product. We're seeing vending machines and security cameras, thermostats, door lock systems. They all matter to the building for those operations employees, but they don't necessarily affect production. However, if they're on the network, they matter, right, from a security perspective. I think that's a big driving factor. There's, in the manufacturing industry, we're obviously a little bit behind in terms of regulation, so there's not as much direct pressure yet. But I think it's coming, and as far as whether it's insurability, customer requests for making sure that our cybersecurity is up to par so that our products are safe and able to be produced in a timely manner so their supply chain is met. But yeah, it's kind of coming at us from every angle at this point.
And so you have obviously very diverse backgrounds in terms of IT folks versus kind of the engineers, asset operators. How do you bring them together? Like, how are you bridging this gap that must exist?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, it's finding those areas of overlap where we all, live and breathe in the same environments. I think, as I mentioned earlier, the IT environment, we have a lot of insight into the network of what's at the plant, but that falls short to some degree to the technical extent that they know their own equipment. And so it starts by working through those things where we have overlaps, and then also having an open mind to learn from each other. It's very easy to get caught up in kind of that not living in each other's shoes scenario where we maybe make assumptions about things that people do and don't know on the other side. I have a background in OT, and so I feel very lucky to be able to maybe communicate a little more effectively on a plant floor than others in IT. But it's still, every time I go to a plant, I'm learning things that are new and interesting. But yeah, that open-mindedness is really important from both sides, because in my experience, everyone's been very receptive. But if the OT group isn't willing to be receptive either, you get stuck pretty quick.
So what does effective communication look like between yourself, someone in your role, and an engineer? Like, how do you guys speak the same language? It's very diverse.
Yeah, I think it's starting with a good set of questions and use cases. So coming in with a plan saying, these are the goals we're trying to accomplish and where we have gaps in knowledge that need to be filled, and letting them know that we're relying on their expertise to help us fill those gaps to meet those goals. Ultimately, things like a complete inventory of devices and some sort of footprint of coverage to monitor those devices. Generally, those are the goals, at least initially. And I think most people from both sides of the fence can agree, at least on that. How those things are accomplished is where it can get fuzzy, and leaning on the expertise of people who know those machines intimately. Many of them have been there when the equipment was originally spec'd and installed. That's a critical piece for us to move forward.
So I'm curious, what kinds of questions do they have for you in terms of some of the controls that you need to implement, or are there concerns about process disruption, for example, or physical safety?
Yeah, definitely. Anything from an IT organization is often viewed initially as more work, right? If we're going to put more systems in place that do monitoring or have any sort of integration into their equipment, they're more worried about, is it going to affect the efficiency? Am I going to have more tasks associated with my daily job? And I think that's where the openness and conversation needs to go back and forth. Sometimes our intent is not to do that, but when we actually put things in place, that's the reality. And so not just making the assumption that a tool isn't going to affect their daily life in a negative way. We have to put those things in place and then continue to monitor and communicate after the fact so that we know if there has been a negative impact, how do we work through that? It's been my experience that if we go in and sort of leave that week assuming everything will run on its own, you're generally not going to get the outcome you're looking for. It has to be a continued partnership.
You've kind of hinted at visibility a couple of times and how important it is. From your perspective, what can visibility enable in terms of security? Like, what is it? You have to have that as a foundation before you can do X, Y, and Z. What are X, Y, and Z?
Yeah, you can't begin to remediate a problem that you don't know exists. And it's easy to say that visibility is strictly related to the devices on the floor and having a list of them. However, visibility for us and our experience with the platforms and putting tools in place is that we are finding that certain procedures may not have been followed correctly. Network design might have been compromised. There's other things that come into play along with just knowing what devices are on the floor. But without that visibility and knowledge, you don't know where to start.
Right. And from an IT perspective, are you finding yourself having to find resources to kind of learn more about the OT network and talk to your peers, your teams about this? Where are you resourcing this kind of information?
I learned pretty quickly when I was tasked with looking into OT cybersecurity at my organization. I learned pretty quickly that there were some gaps in my own knowledge and our organization's knowledge, so we looked for third-party partnerships. Frankly, events like Nexus have been helpful with that, being able to network. Being in manufacturing, we are lagging a bit compared to critical infrastructure, healthcare, finance, where regulation is driving more of that change. Being able to find third-party vendors that are experts in both OT cybersecurity, automation devices, and the IT networking and infrastructure knowledge for how these things all tie together.
So you mentioned you have an OT background. I want to talk a little bit about patching, because this is just a real beast sometimes when it comes to these industrial devices. There's just a lack of there's no tolerance for downtime, for example. Mm-hmm. What are some of the realities about patching and compensating controls for vulnerabilities? Because there are periods of exposure here that you have to consider.
Yeah, it's not uncommon in manufacturing processes that date back 75 to 100 years. There's equipment just as old that we may be intentionally running software that is not currently updated. And as easy as it is to say, let's patch everything and make it on the current version, there's situations where that could affect production. And so I think what I'm learning is that we have to find a way to at least categorize and acknowledge where those instances occur that a patch would affect or could affect production, so that we can acknowledge that risk. We haven't talked about this specifically yet, but this whole conversation around OT cybersecurity is really just about risk management and understanding exactly how much risk we have and how much we're willing to live with. That could vary based on what the product is we're manufacturing, where it's being manufactured, and even to some degree, what the equipment is that's doing the manufacturing. If it's a highly specific piece of equipment that we would have one vendor on earth that could provide it to us, we may have less options on how we proceed versus if it's an off-the-shelf item we've bought that could be provided by many vendors.
So it sounds like you're managing very different types of risk related to OT. For example, there aren't ransomware attacks targeting PLCs specifically, for example, but it sounds like you're managing relationship risk and third parties and suppliers and so forth. Talk to me a little bit about how the risk differs between IT and OT.
Yeah, I just think it's more more of an uncontrolled environment. The variety of access points and device types. In the IT space, I think many of the devices we're familiar with are categorized pretty cleanly into a few smaller buckets. While there is a massive landscape of OEMs and support structures, when you get into a plant floor, the nature of manufacturing is that each unique product requires a unique process to create it, and therefore, even though we have upwards of 10 to 15 manufacturing plants making similar products, they're not the same internally. And so we've found that a critical site design plan is necessary everywhere we go, even if we had just been at a site that makes almost identical product. Mm-hmm. There are decisions that are often made at a plant level, not at an operational level across plants. And those small decisions, as we mentioned, things like vending machines and door lock systems might not be the same, and that could be enough to have a different OT network environment.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious about some of the discussions you may be having with folks above you on the IT side in terms of what's their level of understanding of OT risk? Are they starting from the ground floor, or are they coming in just kind of with a good foundational understanding of what some of these risks are?
Yeah,
how different they may be.
And I feel very fortunate that we have a very strong group of leaders that are pretty plugged in. Obviously, there's been so much in the news to be made of incidents that have occurred across many different organizations and markets. But yeah, the reality is OT cybersecurity is unique enough to cybersecurity that it is different. There are some things that have to be brought forward in terms of educating people at all levels in the business. Part of it is ownership. It is just as important that the C-suite and board of directors at companies know what this is as it is the person who runs the equipment at the line, mm-hmm. right? First point of contact. So to kind of answer the question, we've been able to communicate effectively through running proof of concept projects to show what the tools available can do and why that's important. And then through early implementation, we're also highlighting where our biggest risks have been and how that might extrapolate across our much larger manufacturing footprint.
All right, so before we wrap up, I wanted to ask you about kind of how you're measuring success. Are there certain metrics that you're relying on, certain KPIs? Talk to me a little bit about some of what you've outlined in that direction.
Yeah, and to be frank, we're pretty early in the process, so we're actually getting to the point now where we're trying to develop those, which again, an event like Nexus is very helpful for. I've asked that question of almost everyone I've met here. Sure. That's been further down the journey. But
what are you hearing in terms of?
Yeah, I think right now what's important is we have to categorize what we're finding into broad buckets and then understand and associate risk to that. We know that we are not currently staffed to be able to remediate all the things we're going to find. So being able to take action on the most critical things is where we're trying to head. And additionally, one of the really nice conversations yesterday was around sort of flipping the mentality into, instead of thinking about managing alerts and vulnerabilities, which can be needle in a haystack type approach, thinking more along the lines of risk mitigation. So looking for that exposure and that attack vector, and saying how do we reduce that, as opposed to chasing the 1 in a million perfect hit on an alert.
All right, Jon. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much.